Hi everyone, Tu Lee here, one half of the China EVs and More duo. Lei and I are always thinking about different ways to bring you, our audience, relevant and compelling content about the China EV, AV, and mobility sectors. Especially now that several companies that we've tracked over the last 60 or so episodes have become global phenomenon. China EVs More Max is where we bring you special content in the form of conversations we have with special guests from those sectors. In part 2 of our conversation with Steve Levine, editor at The Electric, he gives us his perspectives on solid-state batteries, raw material procurement, battery production capacity, the shortfall between legacy OEM EV production forecasts and raw material supply, future prospects of CATL and BYD manufacturing in North America, the viability of battery swapping outside of China, and the difficulty of Tesla ramping up production of their 4680 battery cell. You don't see solid state becoming viable commercially by the end of this decade then. Factorial, QuantumScape, those types of companies, SES, I think.
Well, solid state is the electrolyte. It still requires the same cathode and either some kind of anode. All you've done is replace the liquid with a solid. It's crazy when you read solid state is going to change everything. What is it going to change? It doesn't change anything. All it does, it does make batteries safer.
And charges faster,
Why?
right?
Why does it charge faster? But ions have to move through liquid. Why would ions move through a solid faster? They don't. What matters is the anode. So if you can get like a silicon, and it's the graphite that's the problem, right? When the graphite won't absorb the lithium ions as quickly as people want to shove them in to fast charge, and so they end up blocking. Right? They form blotches on the outside of the anode, the graphite anode, and that ends and that's permanent. That's the problem, and that's not solved by solid state.
So Henrik Fisker would pat you on the back and shake your hands. Very good, because he was our first guest, and he was big on solid state, like in 2018 when I last talked to him. And last year at the auto show, he was, no, solid state. That's, no. I think he will be in agreement with you.
Yeah. So solid state, it can enable lithium metal as the anode.
But if you look at the recent announcements from these legacies, I mean, it's already proving your point. 2026, 2028, and this is not mass scale production. This is a timeline where you say, okay, we think we can have a production vehicle, but in large volumes, right, you still have to think post 2030. So I guess, they're in agreement with you.
Yeah. All of these, by the way, all these milestones we talk about before the raw materials, before we understood there was a raw materials crisis, that all gets pushed ahead.
So speaking, you mentioned nickel a few minutes ago. There were two stories or two news from yesterday. So Walter Isaacson, who's writing the biography of Elon Musk, he tweeted that Elon was meeting with the guys from Indonesia on a nickel agreement. And in the shareholder letter from Mary Barra, there's that big paragraph talking about cobalt with Glencore, and then a upcoming announcements on nickel, where these not legacies, but OEMs are working directly to kind of solve this issue. Is that now the kind of, when we talk about those different, whether it's vertical integration or working directly with much more upstream suppliers, is that the kind of the standard going forward, that there's no way around it? What do you think?
Yes, I do. I do think that the auto companies, the major auto companies, which have been for 20 years or 30 years. You're the best at the car industry. When did they stop wanting to vertically integrate?
This was
Delphi. That's it.
50s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but now, so they have to have their own assets. They have to follow China into this of either long-term agreements with the mining companies, or buying outright. I wrote a piece this week. Why, if $46 billion was burning a hole in Elon Musk's pocket, why didn't he buy Albemarle and a couple of lithium companies, right? And put himself, right, like untouchable. He would be unassailable. Yeah. So yes. So these deals you're talking about, super important. I was wondering about. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this meeting that Elon actually had a photograph taken of him with the Indonesian minister and the other, right?
Holding up something, right?
Yeah, and they're all wearing suits, and he's in his black T-shirt, hanging at. So anyway, but so Indonesia is right. They want to. They have all that nickel.
Talk about geopolitics. Yeah,
and they want to be, but they want to be added value. They don't want to be, hey, you're just taking our raw material. They want the cathodes. They want the whole process made there, and that's so smart.
What they want to do is they want to dethrone Thailand from Southeast Asia and Vietnam for being a hub for manufacturing, right?
It's so smart. Yeah, it's good. Okay, but my question is, Indonesia also has the highest energy, not the highest, but a very high energy intensity for the nickel that they produce, and the processes that they're using also are is it called HPA? It begins with an H. Or HAP.
I'm not sure.
Acid leaching.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And, so this is why prior to this, Elon had avoided Indonesia and gone to New Caledonia because cleaner method of. So I've wondered. Okay, so the Indonesians, he didn't invite the Indonesians there, right? They are selling themselves to him, and they did talk about ESG, but I'm wondering, will he do a deal? Will they clean up these methods so that he can do a deal?
But Tesla's has been in discussions with Indonesia for at least a couple of years. I know they were talking about. Tesla never said that they were going to build manufacturing there, but you knew he was there for one reason, or Tesla was there for one reason. So that's been in the news for the last couple of years. So
okay, it has, but again, he hasn't done a deal. Like for example, VW just went ahead and signed, right, and did a very large nickel and cobalt deal.
But you have to remember, Steve, when we're talking a GM and a Volkswagen, this is existential for them, right? With Elon, it's 1.5 million cars in 2022 that he wants to build, right?
Right.
That's a quarter of production for GM. That is less than 20% of annual global production for a Volkswagen, right? And so they're looking at securing raw materials because if they don't have it, they're shutting down dozens of factories, right? Where I think there's a little more flexibility with Tesla, than there is for these legacy automakers. So
okay, but to the, I just want to make sure that we're on point here. Are you saying that Elon is cool with the Indonesians? He's not so concerned about these environmental questions.
I think they will follow whatever Indonesia's local policies are when it comes to that stuff, right? Like, for instance, might be Shanghai Gigafactory probably runs a little bit different than Berlin Gigafactory, than Austin Gigafactory, right? And, just like Nike, we follow the local laws and the policies of the countries that we do business in, right? So we also have to remember that Tesla has that reality distortion field. So regardless of who you are, you kind of want to work with Tesla to be able to say, I work with Tesla. Whereas GM, I don't think there's that cachet, or Volkswagen, there's not that cachet, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
but man, this has been an amazing. We haven't asked any one of our questions, by the way, Steve. We're just riffing.
No, I
We're
mean,
just talking.
I think they've been mixed in the questions.
So, so what are your thoughts on the China market? Because to your point, right, you saw this canary in the coal mine. You wrote this book in 2014 or 2015. So you saw around the corner, you saw these angles. And to a lesser extent, that's why Lei and I started this podcast, right? Because as Americans living abroad, we saw that this tidal wave was coming from China. And to your point, the legacies, although they sell millions of cars in China, they just weren't waking up to the fact that this EV tidal wave was coming from China. And so it was important for us to really create an awareness that if you're not ready and you're caught flat-footed, this thing is going to knock you off your feet, right? This tidal wave. And so, what are your thoughts on, because CATL in Q1 was 50% of production of battery cells in China. So they're the 800-pound gorilla. They're continuing to build capacity. Everybody's building capacity. Northvolt is building 6 gigafactories, right? LG in the United States, Panasonic. Now, do you see in 10 years, 12 years overcapacity, specifically in the LFP side?
So we're talking about two different things. One is the cell making, the gigafactories, and the other one is the raw materials. There definitely is overcapacity of gigafactories announced, and they're not going to all be built.
Right.
Benchmark talks about maybe 70% of them will be built, and then remember the gigafactories are not all made equal. They're tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and they not everyone is a CATL in terms of their ability to make a really good battery. So yes, there's overcapacity in the cell making, but not on the materials.
Right.
There's still not. But you get into this situation. Jeff Dahn is a very we haven't mentioned him, but he's like they're next to John Goodenough, the inventor of the batteries as we know them. Right. He's turning 100 years old this year. He's still working on batteries. But anyway, but next to him, Jeff Dahn is the biggest thing there is in batteries. And so he's, for those who don't know, professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and he is the key battery advisor to Tesla, the key outside advisor. And so he talks about when you look at the trajectory of EV production over decades. So we got this decade, then we got the 2030s. Once you get into the 2040s and you're really at scale and you are replacing the combustion fleet, you need metals that are at a concentration in the Earth's crust of 200 parts per million. This is his number, right? He gave a talk 2 weeks ago at a battery conference down in Florida that I attended. When you get to that scale, 200 parts per million, you exclude lithium, cobalt, and nickel, and so you have iron and manganese still, and some other. You still have sodium, you still have sulfur. So when we get up to scale, this will affect everyone. The batteries that we know today, the chemistries we know today, will be marginalized, and will have sodium ion will have to work, sulfur will have to work, and those are inferior in the air. Like, they are not going to take a car 300 miles, and they won't they won't do a lot of the things that we want them to do. And so, it just means that the landscape is going to change. CATL, of course, is on top of this, but whereas I think that Chinese automakers, Chinese battery makers, and we haven't mentioned BYD. I think BYD makes the best all-around EV battery on the planet. The Blade battery, the best that there is, and it's so underestimated. I mean, we know what it is, but if you go out on the street, like, does anyone know what this is? And
I was reading that they're going to add about 150 gigawatt hours of capacity this year in China.
Yeah.
So,
and so, people are going to, the car makers will, the Western car makers will do business with BYD and the Blade. But if you go to 2030, the forecasts are that total around the world, between 25 and 40 million EVs are made, and China is like at least half of that, and Tesla. So where does Tesla end up? Right, Tesla is going to make 1.5 million batteries EVs this year, and then and that's only with Giga Austin and Giga Berlin starting to crank up. So they're going to go, right? It's totally reasonable to expect 2 million next year and 5 million in 2025 from Tesla, from the four, right? Shanghai, Austin, Fremont, and Berlin, right? That you can get 5 million.
To hammer your point home, Steve, Elon said that on the earnings call that he foresees 50% growth over the next several years.
Right. So I did the numbers on that. So he's talking about if I can call it up here, about 50%. If you do, it just went straight to that page. If you do the math, right? So he's talking about 20 million or 22 million by 2030 or 2032. If it's 50% a year, in 2028, it's 16.8 million. In 2029, it's 25 million. In 2030, it's 38 million. I don't think he gets it, but I'm just saying if that happened, that would be the growth.
Well, it's the other thing too, though, Steve. It's also that gigafactories need to open 2 or 3 a year as well. Then, right? So
yeah, and okay, but where I'm getting to is I'm returning to that theme. If China has got half of that, let's say it's 40 million. Let's say it's 40, because you count what Ford and GM both say they want to be making 2 million EVs a year by 2025.
Right.
So what is that in 2030? VW wants to be making 4.5 million in 20. When you add all those up, you get to about 20 million or 22 million from the major car makers, not including China, not including Tesla. And so when you add, right, Tesla. If Tesla does, let's say Tesla just gets 10 million and doesn't get to 20 million. So that's 33. And then China, 10 or 14 million, 43 or 45 million EVs. That's what they say they want. Do they get made? Again, everyone else is scrambling.
Really quickly, Steve, for context, for our audience, the world buys between 75 and 85 to 90 million cars a year. So 50% at 2030 would mean around 40 million cars were EVs. And so that's where Steve is getting his numbers from. If 50% of the cars being sold are electric, and remember that we're not just talking about Europe, China, and the United States. We're talking about Brazil, where EV adoption, or South America, we're talking about Southeast Asia, where EV adoption is going to take a lot longer than the major regions, I think. So there's still going to be petrol vehicles sold in 2030 for sure. So
yes, and then look at the number. So if you've got China with 15 and Tesla, well, let's say it's 10, that's 25. If numbers, that's 15 million divided by everyone else. it is, you start out this part of our conversation. You asked about where is China? China, this is China's world, right? China and Tesla. China and Tesla's world in 2030, what it looks like at this stage. And again, we'll talk again in 2030 and see where things really, really went. But at this stage, that's what it looks like.
And if we're giving credit, guys, we should probably call out BYD, right? Because BYD is going to be a player for sure in 2030.
Yeah.
To your point earlier, Steve, about how you said consolidation is likely to happen in the automotive sector by 2030. I had said months ago, last year, that in 2030, I could see in the top 10 some legacy automakers, some EV first companies like a Tesla or a NIO, and then some technology companies in the top 10 of mobility companies, because they won't be called automotive companies anymore. So I totally agree with you. I think there's going to be the weaker players are just going to get eaten up. And I see opportunities for tech companies to acquire assets on the cheap from weak automakers. And so they can, instead of being a contract manufacturer, outsourcing manufacturing, they can just buy a factory super cheap and then build on their own, where they have total control of design and manufacturing, right? So
yes,
Yeah.
and isn't Musk's swooping in and just saying, "Well, I'm going to own Twitter." Isn't that what this is, right? I mean, Apple or whomever can just say, "I'm going to buy," just name the company, right? And 2 weeks later, they own it.
And it's not just Apple, because Apple, Google, Amazon, they have hundreds of billions of dollars in the bank doing nothing.
Right.
Hundreds of billions of dollars.
So speaking of the volumes, you have to also think about of those 40 million EVs, how much are the robotaxi fleets not privately owned? Right? That's another kind of the topic that we haven't touched upon. What would that picture, what would that outlook look like? Because most of the robotaxis are EVs, right? That's a given.
Yeah, and what are you thinking of? Just where's your brain in this sector?
I would imagine they will account for a big portion, right, based on what's happening in China, right?
Yeah.
I think the only way these car companies get to these numbers that we're talking about, a handful of them, not all of them, right? Because we all believe that not every single legacy automaker is going to hit their proclaimed forecast or their goals in 2025 or 2027, right? But in 2026, 2027, I'll give you for instance, Steve, we interviewed Maxwell Zhou, who is the founder CEO of Deep Route. Okay. Deep Route just announced a $10,000 hardware software stack, level 4 autonomous, that he's partnering with automakers to bolt on at the factory, okay, that are integrated into the OEM's vehicle. So not as a separate add-on after the vehicle is built. And so if we get to let's say $4,000 for a level 4 hardware software stack, every car is going to have them pretty much by 26, 27. And so I believe the trend is going to be private car ownership is still going to go down. It'll balance out because China will grow a little bit, because there are around 22, 24 million cars a year being sold. Let's say they go up to 27, 28 by 2030, but US is still going to go down. I think Europe's going to go down. Car sharing, ride hailing, and then robotaxis will, I think, take over that delta between private car ownership and the rides that still need to happen, right?
Yeah. So this is interesting. You guys know a lot more about what's happening with the robotaxi space. I'm interested in what you've said about the level 4. Is this, which, people talk about it, but no one is really there yet. I mean, has this guy shown that he really does have, I mean, there's the proper testing and all of that?
He just launched, or Deep Route just launched 30 of them in Shenzhen.
Right.
So they're being tested right now.
Right.
And piloted. And so I think most CEOs will tell you that and Lei had really hammer this home for me, they'll tell you that they're L4 capable, but from a policy and a law standpoint, they can't say that, right? They can't say that they're L4. But even Elon had to get his wrist slapped for FSD, right? Because the lawyers basically told him that you have to say they're only L2 capable or we're going to be liable, right? So
Right. And is he saying L4? Because L4 should mean that you can go anywhere. Or is it L4 on a fixed route?
So when we say anywhere, we're basically saying point to point, right? I get in the car, it takes me anywhere I want, and I don't touch the wheel ever, right?
Right.
What's going to end up happening is there's going to be a combination of locations being geofenced that allow for it. There's going to be speed limits that that are governed. It can't go faster than 30 miles an hour. And then there's going to be certain use cases that allow for, like in a traffic jam or for a commercial vehicle on the highway between this point and this point. And so when you get into level 4, that's when we also need to talk about commercial trucking, because robotaxis from a private passenger taking over for a DD driver or an Uber driver, that's probably still a good 10, 12 years out. But certain from point to point. But use cases, that could happen in the next 3 or 4 years, right?
Right. So that's right. I mean, in my view, that's kind of an level 4 with an asterisk. But it is interesting. I mean, it's a way I've wondered about that since level 5 may never happen, right? I mean, it could, but it may never happen. What are the commercial cases for level 3 and 4? And you just named, right? You just named some.
And the thing that when we talk about level 4 and taking the driver out, it has completely different implications in China than it does in the United States and Europe, right? There's unions in the US and Europe, but now we're talking, and people are going to be displaced out of a job in China, right? And the Chinese government's number one goal is to keep people employed, not for companies to be profitable per se, right? And so they're going to really, really manage how the technology gets rolled out to ensure that there's not all of a sudden 2 million taxi drivers that are displaced and with nowhere to go, right? So I think that's where China is going to be a little bit different than the rest of the world.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Well, that's so you can imagine. Like I was just looking before we got on this call that Lucid had sold 100,000 of its vehicles to the Saudis. So it just this is just lay what you were saying. I mean,
yeah, I heard about that. Yeah.
These fleets can be just a huge customer for the EV makers.
Hertz with Tesla and Polestar, and
Yep.
there'll be more, right? And switch gears a little bit, battery swapping. What's your stance? I mean, could that be a viable business model here in the US? Because NIO, without a doubt, they're coming. A matter of time.
Yeah.
And they'll bring that over.
And CATL?
Yeah, CATL, sure.
They just announced that their partnership with iWays, an EV company here. So
yeah, so I've watched that. I've watched the way that swapping is taking off in China, and it also is in India with two-wheelers.
In Taiwan.
Yeah, so I'm skeptical about swapping in the United States, not because it's a bad idea. I think it's a great idea. It's a way of significantly reducing the cost to us of buying an EV, a swapping situation. If you're just leasing, the battery, or just paying for the use of the battery, but it requires the automakers to change their whole plan, right? Just the way they're making their vehicles, and requires them to make commitments about the batteries and about how every single vehicle they're going to make from now and for forever is going to be made. They haven't done that, and so I think it's going to be niche in the U.S. At best. It's going to be niche. I do see that we didn't get there quite, but that you do have China becoming the new Japan in terms of being just a major retailer of its EVs and wholesaler of its batteries in North America, in the United States, and that's because of necessity on the battery side, and on the car side, just because they're competitive. So they will come in. But in terms of swapping, I don't see the other major car makers, switching that direction.
You had a good discussion with Levi for that mobility conference that we sponsored. So that was an interesting. I enjoyed that one. So
Levi wants this to happen, and so Levi's a salesman, right? So
he's very convincing. He's very convincing.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I met Levi about 10 years ago, 2013, at a conference I think it was in Wuhan. And he was showing me his book on what's the title? Great
Race.
Great Race, yeah. He's a funny guy.
Yeah, he's very, very convincing. So I just thought of this one. Who do you think would be first to build capacity in North America? BYD or CATL, and why?
Well, BYD is already doing it. BYD is already in California.
Well, I mean, like battery cell manufacturing capacity.
Okay.
Do you think CATL is a little bit too controversial, or?
That's a good question. I guess I would stick with BYD because they already have their foot down. Like it doesn't seem to me to be a big jump for them to say, well, okay, we're also going to, on our land in Lancaster, California, we're also going to build cells. But CATL is really scouting. They're really going to do this. And I've talked to folks who they spoke to in Mexico, but they want a good deal. They feel like they're in the driver's seat, and they want wherever they go to give them like a sweetheart deal. Like they want 25% of the cost to be borne by the place they're at. So the Mexicans said, well, we're not going to do that. And so they moved on from there. Let's see if they can get that kind of a deal either in Canada or the United States.
But that's the thing though, right, Steve? They kind of have to be in Mexico or Texas or Arizona if they're going to supply the Austin Giga, right?
Yeah, this is true. So maybe CATL has to do the compromising.
If I was the Mexico foreign direct investment people, I'd be like, okay, we have the leverage because you actually don't want to be building in the US. There's going to be way too many controversies with that, right? So if you build in Mexico, we still have the free trade agreement. We ship across the border, we're done, right?
Right, but what if you do a deal? What if you're CATL and we have, the USMCA, the new NAFTA, requires 70% local content. So what if, CATL does a deal? First of all, you've got Musk, saying, I want this factory. And CATL says, okay, not right away, but over the 10 years, we will source all of the, 70% of the nickel and so on right here in North America. I think they would. I think Texas would say yes, and the government would say yes.
That's the other thing, Steve. You don't think the governor of Alabama would be like, come on in? The governor of Mississippi would be like, yeah, we'd love to have you. So yes. Maybe CATL knows that and is leveraging Mexico because they'd rather build in Mexico than they would in Alabama, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's a good. What do you guys think? What happens in that game?
Lei, what do you think, man?
I don't know. I mean, BYD definitely has the basis already, right? BYD just launched in Mexico. BYD seems they're everywhere. They're in the US. Their EVs are now everywhere around the US. Yeah, Costa Rica, Mexico, Bahamas, Right? So,
Oh, there's a few. Remember Taylor? There's a few parked in Silicon Valley, right? So
yeah, in Michigan. Yeah.
yes, in Michigan. So
So, but yeah. So I would tend to agree with Steve a bit.
here's the last serious question, Steve, and then we'll wrap it up. We've basically gone the entire conversation without a specific Tesla question. We've brought them up, but we haven't asked. So I'm going to break the streak. Why has it been so hard for Tesla to get the 4680 battery mass produced?
Because it's not just the carcass. It's all of those bells and whistles that Musk wants inside. And so all you have to do is have this conversation on Twitter, and like you get all the maniacs, the Tesla mania. I mean, they are just fervent on this. They're angry. How dare you talk about the 4680? And so I know I'm going to get in trouble on this one. They're just not there, right? They're the 4680. They want tabless, and they want the dry cathode processing, DBE, and they're definitely not there with the DBE. It's just this slow process. They only turned out enough of the 4680s in Fremont. Is it for 1,000, like 1,000 watt? Yeah, Model Ys. And so, I've been talking around, to people about the DBE. It's hard. It's really hard, right? And it really is. It's just taking dry stuff, and it's cereal with no milk in it. How do you get that to stay and to be uniformly coated fast, right? Super fast on these and safely. And so that's hard, so they have to figure that out. And so maybe they go without. So they go, okay, but let's say they don't really want, or they decide they're going to compromise and not do the dry processing. If they were there on tablets at scale and at the rate, at the yield, with the right yield, they would be producing it. So they're not there yet. They're not there yet with the tablets either. Even though everyone, you're stupid, Levine. Are you Musk's nephew? Do you know this stuff? Why do you know? And they always sort of link to something and say, "Didn't you see this?" And if he could make the 4680s with the tablets at scale, he would be doing it.
Steve, just wait. Now that he owns Twitter, they're going to feel like they own Twitter now too, right?
Yeah.
So they're going to be like, don't jump off my platform if you're going to talk badly about Tesla, right? Like,
right. And they don't say, they always word things like, they don't just say, "Hey, I disagree with you and this is why." It's very insulting, the language.
This has been a great conversation. I learned a ton, and I'd love to just do this like once every couple of months just to catch up. But thank you for joining us, Steve. Let me throw this out. Do you have any other questions for Lei or I?
Yeah, let's see. Let's see. Well, I guess I would be interested in, there is a question I'd be interested in. And so CATL and Goshen and BYD and so on, they are the 800-pound gorillas in the battery space. It's not logical that they just stay in China doing what they're doing. Just like it wasn't logical that Toyota and Nissan and so on were going to stay in Japan and just name your. So my question is, let's say it's 2030, 10 years from now, do we have these companies? They are based in North America. They are the 800-pound gorillas here and in Europe making the EV batteries.
Well, CATL is halfway there, or they're already there, right? With the Thuringia plant in Germany that's recently gotten, there was a news about them getting Was it approval or something?
I think for the initial 15 gigawatt hours or something like that.
Yeah. It sounds small, right?
Mm-hmm.
When they're building 100 and something gigawatt hour factory in Ningda, right?
So wouldn't be surprising. It's inevitable that they have to, be where your customers are.
But this goes back to a question, Steve, and we'd written it down, but we didn't ask it. But I'll bring it up now because you do talk about geopolitics. Do you think there's going to be at least some protectionism in Europe and or in the United States that says we can't let this 800-pound gorilla come in here? And if nothing else, the Koreans and Japanese in the United States would be like, no, you can't have them come in, right? Because they're going to undercut us on pricing, at least on the LFP side, right? And so I don't know. Do you think there would be some protectionism in the United States or Europe if they saw that risk?
Well, so I know less about Europe, but in the U.S., I think that if one, necessity is going to play a role, but if the 70% rule is imposed, you defang. Then it becomes much more benign. It's guys who know what they're doing, but they're totally using the local economy to do it. It's like the Japanese and the Germans are huge manufacturers, automobile manufacturers in the United States. No one says a word.
BMW manufactures more cars in the United States than they do in Germany.
Right. So if you go there, then I wonder if these nationalistic questions get tamped down. That's what I would say.
Well, I think the fact of the matter is that specifically on the U.S. side, the understanding should be there's no American CATL, there's no American LG, there's no American Panasonic, there's no American company that's known in the battery space, right? So they have to bring these, in the case of GM and Ford, they already have the Kentucky and the Tennessee battery cell plants working with SK and LG. It's besides the nationalistic and the geopolitical, at the end of the day, it might just come down to made in America. Whoever is bringing the jobs and make things in America, I'm not sure if I care where they're from at the end of the day.
The irony is that CATL might be the catfish for the United States. Or BYD might be the catfish and create that catfish effect for the US.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's the best point of the whole conversation. That's interesting. Yeah.
I guess we will end it on that.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. And you guys are an institution, and so it's totally cool.
Hi, your co-host Lei Xing here. Having had this long conversation with Steve was really eye-opening for me, not only because of the history lesson, but also because of a myriad of factors at play in order for future EV volumes to materialize, whether it's geopolitics, battery cell supremacy, raw material allocation, or tons of other internal and external factors, such as the chip shortage and the lingering pandemic. Steve helped us put things into perspective that not all is going to be smooth sailing as the industry transitions to an electrified future, which means there will bound to be winners and losers. We just don't know whom yet.
Lei and I will be sharing more of our conversations with the men and women around the world, moving the EV, AV, and mobility sectors forward as part of this China EVs and More Max series. Some folks will be instantly recognizable, but some will just be people that are doing amazing things in the space that we think deserve to be highlighted. Don't worry though, Lei and I will continue to host our live weekly China EVs and More Twitter Spaces room that summarizes that week's most important news coming out of the China EV, AV, and mobility space. For those that can't catch the live show, You can find the China EVs and More pod on all major platforms or wherever you normally get your podcasts. As EV adoption reaches its global tipping point, it'll be even more important to stay updated on everything that's happening here. Lei and I are confident that China EVs and More is the best resource to do that. Until next time, as always, thanks for listening.